Previously on Between the Lines.
It took an incredible amount of inner strength to move north and west of the Ohio and persevere. As the Americans continued moving west, there was another people already there and believing in the very same things, the native people.
They will never have recourse to arms unless driven to it by a series of injustice and oppression. Governor William Henry Harrison, 1806.
Harrison was determined to have Indiana join the Union as a state. Standing in his way was a Shawnee Indian by the name of Tecumseh.
By 1811, the feeling of peace in the area had been changing.
He would be attacked and compelled to it by the force under your command. Secretary of War William Eustis.
The Battle of Tippecanoe did not end the Indian problems, it just added to it.
That September, Indiana Territory erupted into bloodshed and violence.
At night, there came one of the Rangers and shot through the window and killed the squaw.
As the disastrous year of 1812 would prove, the United States was ill-prepared to fight a war, let alone declare one. A path to victory had to be found, and so did the men who would do the fighting. Congress could create regiments with a stroke of their pens, but finding the men who would fill the ranks was going to be another matter. Jacob wrote about one such group of recruits in that February of 1815 letter.
There has been armed men enlisted for the term of 1 year called Rangers.
Shortly after the Battle of Tippecanoe in November of 1811, it became clear that the government had to do something to protect the western settlements. Congress authorized 7 companies of mounted troops to be organized with the mission of the protection of the western settlements. To paraphrase Ninian Edwards, governor of the Illinois Territory, infantry is good for building forts and defending them, but it will take mounted rifles to win the Indian War. And he was right. But being a United States Ranger was not about the arms you carried. Being a Ranger was your training and your mindset.
Charlotte Goulet Weaver's brother, Elisha Goulet, was a prominent citizen in Switzerland County. He was commissioned a captain in the Indiana militia and began recruiting men. He was charged with ranging the north line of Jefferson County as far as the settlements extended.
By the time the year 1812 came to an end, it was clear that this was not going to be a short war. We'd suffered stunning defeats in the east, and here in the west, the number of attacks on the settlements was growing. Congress was pressured to take further action, so authorized 10 additional companies. Indiana was to have 4 companies.
By September of 1812, hostilities had increased. To counter that, an additional company of Rangers was raised. 14 men were recruited from Switzerland County, and 2 of those men, Louis and David Goulet, were also Charlotte's brothers.
Daniel McCoy was a private and captured James Bigger's company of Rangers from Clark County, Indiana. As an older gentleman, McCoy talked about the many charges they made on Indian raiding parties. He said they would hunt them down, and when they had overtaken the Indians, they would corner them and kill them, like killing wolves. Daniel McCoy said he wished he would not remember the times that they were charging upon the Indians. He wished he just did not have those memories. In fact, if you look at military orders from the time, we find reference to soldiers being ordered to go on the hunt, and there was yet hunting to be done. By the end of the year 1813, the United States Rangers had become the effective military presence of the Army in the Western Territories.
Franklin County in 1813 would also organize a company of Rangers. It would be commanded by Frederick Schultz.
Schultz was a businessman and entrepreneur and was into a lot of business ventures. He had long service in the militia, rising to the ranks of major.
Frederick Schultz was assigned the command of Fort Harrison. He and his men soon found themselves engaged in numerous skirmishes with the Indians.
The Indians again have made their appearance on our frontiers. They fired upon and killed 1 man and wounded another of Captain Schultz's company of Rangers. The man killed received 5 balls. 7 passed through his hat. 2 men belonging to Captain Schultz's company of Rangers, stationed at Fort Harrison, were killed within 200 or 300 yards of the fort, and the Indians appeared in considerable number around it.
To a solitary ranger of Schultz's company, those skirmishes proved one thing. There was yet hunting to be done. By 1814, The large numbers of enthusiastic volunteers from Kentucky was becoming fewer. Severe war weariness was setting in. Schultz's company had an aggregate strength of less than 100 men. Entrusted with defending the corridor, they were strung out from south of Vincennes northward to Fort Harrison. The area was a powder keg about to explode. It just required a single spark. That spark came on the evening of December 5th, 1814.
There were orders from Indian Agent Judge Park that no Indian was to be invited into the forts or into the settlements. But if they were to show up on their own accord, they were to be treated with kindness, and an attempt made to make a bond between the Indians and the United States.
Benjamin Park was a federal judge. He commanded militia and dragoons at the Battle of Tippecanoe. He was well respected by the Americans and by the natives.
The Western Sun newspaper was printed in Vincennes. In the custom of the time, newspapers often reprinted stories from other publications. The story Jacob Weaver related to his brother Abraham appears to have been taken in part by articles found in the Sun. To understand what really occurred versus what Jacob and the newspapers wrote will require a line-by-line analysis.
There was an Indian chief and his squaw someplace on the Wabash River on some business.
From information from Fort Harrison, it appears that a few days since, a Kickapoo chief and his wife came to that post with strong professions of amity and goodwill toward the United States.
It was Monday, December 5th, 1814. First Lieutenant Blasdale of Captain Schultz's company of United States Rangers was commandant of Fort Harrison at the time. And there was a Kickapoo chief named Joseph Fox, and he shows up the fort with his wife. Joseph and his people were from a village up on the Vermilion River, about 30 miles above Fort Harrison. Joseph brought with him peace sticks that showed his allegiance with the United States. He says the rest of the party of Kickapoo and Potawatomi from the Vermilion would be down at the fort in 2 or 3 days.
Well, the wind blew hard and the river was deep, so they could not get over.
The weather that December had been bad, and the rivers frozen over, and it was bitterly cold. Lieutenant Blasdale found the chief and his wife were in need of food. They were especially in need of bread, and he said that they were half naked. They needed clothing and blankets. Blasdale gave them some corn, tobacco, and ammunition, and even though that was not much, they seemed very pleased with what they did receive. Fort Harrison was in a weak position and had been for quite some time. Food, provisions were running low, and Rangers were actually in the very same position that the Indians were. Blasdale sits down and he writes Captain Schultz a letter and tells him that the Indians are coming into the fort. As it turns out, Captain Schultz showed up at Fort Harrison at dark. Schultz knew that if he turned them away from Fort Harrison, the Kickapoo would have no other place to go than to the British for provisions. That's the last thing they wanted.
A captain of the Rangers, as I'm informed, told the chief that he could stay in his house till next morning.
He was hospitably received by the commanding officer and taken to his quarters to lodge.
It was cold that night. Captain Schultz invited the chief and his wife into the quarters for the evening.
At night, there came one of the Rangers and shot through the window and killed the squaw.
And whilst asleep, a ranger fired his piece through the window or an aperture of the house at them and killed the squaw.
At 10 o'clock that night, a soldier in Captain Schultz's company slipped around and aimed through the window and fired a shot. The ball struck the chief's wife that was by his side. She died within 2 minutes. The soldier was most likely trying to kill the chief. The murderer was captured and placed in irons, and that's something that seemed to please the chief. The situation of the Rangers was desperate at the time. Seeing the half-naked Indians taken into the warmth and comfort of the commandant's quarters and treated as royalty, while the rest of the men were suffering, was just too much. It appeared as though the captain had become an Indian sympathizer and was acting in a way subservient to them, which meant the rest of the Rangers were subservient to the naked Indians as well. It was just too much for the soldier to take, and his hatred boiled up inside of him. He didn't join the Rangers to make peace with them or give them acts of kindness. So the soldier did the one thing he was trained to do: kill Indians.
If not quickly extinguished, the murder of Joseph Fox's wife was going to be the spark which ignited the Western territories. Rumors of peace with Great Britain were in the air, but here in the West, intelligence had been received of future Indian attacks. The brutality of those attacks and American retribution for them was something neither side was prepared for or wanted. Would keeping a man in chains rectify the situation, or did it require something more?
Immediately after the murder, Captain Schultz writes Captain Andre, acting district commandant of the Rangers in Vincennes, telling him of the murder. Schultz asks Andre to come to Fort Harrison as soon as possible and bring Judge Park and Baron, the interpreter. Judge Park decided to send Major Toussaint Dubois to Fort Harrison in his place.
Toussaint Dubois, Canadian-born, came to the United States with his brothers. Dubois was the perfect man for the situation. He knew the language, he knew the customs, the natives respected him. Harrison respected him by referring to him as a man of honor and integrity.
Dubois sent for Chief Joseph to come back to the fort. When Joseph came back, he didn't come alone, however. He brought another Kickapoo chief and 3 principal chiefs of the Wea and the Miami with him. And walking behind them was over 300 Kickapoo and Potawatomi. This concerned Dubois very much.
Dubois had every reason to be concerned. He was going to be facing Chief Joseph and his band alone. Joseph had returned more than just to accept gifts. He was there to show the Americans he and his people would not be disrespected. What happened next is something we as 21st century individuals cannot comprehend.
Dubois presented Chief Joseph with a present. Now, think about that. The military had just killed the chief's wife and gave him a gift in return. What kind of gift do you give for a life? What is a life worth? You cannot explore that mindset through the eyes of a Euro-American. You have to understand gift-giving through the eyes of a Native American. To us, it is about the material value of the object. The more expensive the item, the more important it is. But to the Native American, it is the act of giving. It is the act that is important. You're showing respect. You are honoring that person, that village, and their ancestors. That act of giving forms a friendship and a bond between the two that can even be considered a kinship. The gift could have been a peace medal. It could have been a coat, which would have been nice to have on a cold winter's day, but it could also have been a number of gifts, which the chief could then distribute among his people. It gave the chief power.
The Kickapoo chief accepted the present offered to atone for the loss of his wife, and as regards the Indians, that unpleasant affair may be considered as satisfactorily adjusted. Western Sun, December 24th, 1814.
Were it not for Toussaint Dubois, this story would have ended rather differently. Judge Park was correct in sending him. His knowledge of native customs and the respect he showed them extinguished the spark which had been struck on December the 5th. We don't know what words Dubois said, but he saved the western frontier from violence too horrifying to contemplate. Toussaint Dubois was indeed a man of honor and integrity. Jacob mentions one more thing before he closed this letter.
Since this happened, the Indians came to that place and murdered some of the people.
The Indians have killed a ranger belonging to Captain Schultz's company of rangers. A horse belonging to a citizen had come home alone. The owner was missing, and that 2 children were also missing from the same neighborhood. There were at that time a considerable number of Indians encamped about 6 miles off with their families. The citizens were raising en masse to kill the whole band. Judge Park and Captain Schultz were endeavoring to put a stop to so rash a measure. It is believed the murderer was brother to the squaw that was killed at Fort Harrison last fall by one of Schultz's rangers.
The story of America is a complex one. There's so many pieces of this puzzle that fit together, and if we lose track of those pieces, we never have the full picture. If we don't learn how these things happen and how America moved and how we survived as a country, we don't know how to move forward.
We should not forget the events that helped build Indiana during the War of 1812. We must not forget Americans, Kickapoo, Miami, Wea, and many more who struggled to call this place home. When I walk the Tippecanoe battlefield, I can feel the presence of those souls, red and white, who fell that fateful day.
You see, the natives and the Americans, in a way, were not unalike. They were fighting for the very same thing, and that was their claim to life and land. And when you look back through history, you find such struggles are the hardest fought, the bloodiest, and the most lost. That's because such wars are fought from the heart, and those are always the worst kind.
To understand the events of 1812 and the thinking and behavior of a people 2 centuries removed, we must try to eliminate from our minds the ideas and opinions that have shaped our 21st century thinking. To understand our history, we must substitute another set of ideas that were important to the men and women of an earlier age.
Despite the murder of his wife, Chief Joseph Fox remained friendly to the United States. But this story is so much deeper. His father's name was Joseph Renard. Renard was anti-American in his viewpoint. He was also one of the principal chiefs in the attack against Fort Harrison in September of 1812. The day prior to that attack, Renard had planned to lure Zachary Taylor outside to the Treaty Arbor, and there he planned to murder him. Renard is the French word for fox. His son held the opposite viewpoint and anglicized his last name. He too would show up at Fort Harrison, but in 1814 with offers of peace. The ideological differences between Joseph and his father, as well as others within the tribes, is something few ever hear about today. Almost 50 years later, in 1860, the United States itself would be torn apart by different ideologies. Tecumseh died in Canada in 1813 at the Battle of the Thames. The man who supposedly killed him was Colonel Richard Mentor Johnson from Kentucky. Partly due to that claim, Johnson would be elected to the vice presidency in 1837. His political slogan was Rumsey Dumpsey, Johnson killed Tecumseh. Both Zachary Taylor and William Henry Harrison would be elected President of the United States. Harrison would die after only 31 days in office. Some attribute his death to a supposed curse placed upon him by the prophet, called the Curse of Tippecanoe. Zachary Taylor would have a long and notable military career, most especially during the war with Mexico. He was affectionately known by his troops as Old Rough and Ready. Elected to the presidency in 1848, he too would die in office. Frederick Schultz, who was in command of Fort Harrison at the time of the murder, finished his service with the Rangers. He became an important Indiana businessman. In 1818, he helped found the town of Hindustan on the White River. Smallpox destroyed the town. Today, no trace of it remains. Toussaint Dubois, the man of honor and integrity, who single-handedly diffused a volatile and deadly situation, mysteriously drowned in Clay County, Illinois in March of 1816.
On Monday last, in attempt to cross the Little Wabash River, was drowned Major Toussaint Dubois. In him the poor have lost a benefactor, his country a friend. He was a kind husband, an indulgent father, and an honest man.
The man who saved the Indiana and Illinois regions from untold violence is buried in an unmarked grave at the Old Cathedral French and Indian Cemetery in Vincennes. But what was the fate of the ranger that committed the murder? No one knows. We don't even know his name. The records are still silent in that matter. After being held in chains for several weeks, he was quietly released. With an Indian war looming, keeping a man in irons for killing an Indian seemed neither prudent nor helpful. Fort Harrison was extremely undermanned. The Rangers were going to need every man. The Western Sun, that Vincennes newspaper, gives us the best closing comment. Written by those who actually experienced this event, it is neither colored by political correctness nor distilled by the passage of 200 years.
As regards the act itself, nothing at present need be said. An act so atrocious furnishes its own commentary.